Welcome to Roof of the World, Tibet in Context, a podcast by the Foundation for Non-Violent Alternatives. So welcome to Tibet Roof of the World podcast. And we have Gabriel Lafitte, who has followed Tibet for decades. Today we're going to be speaking about the future of Tibet. And we're going to kick off, Gabriel, by talking about a rare meeting that happened among Tibetan exiles in 2022 and beyond.
Well, why would a non-Tibetan weigh in on the future of Tibet? Fortunately, this is something I can comment on because Tibetans in 2024 took the initiative to stage several gatherings of young Tibetans in exile in New York, Washington, Paris, Dharamsala, to explore a wide range of scenarios for the future of Tibet. And I think it's very sobering reading to see the different scenarios that they came up with because they were trying so hard to be realistic and to, look in the face the painful possibilities that face Tibet at the moment, which, we can elaborate on shortly. But it also, I thought, was a really interesting exercise because it focused on the long term. And I think all too often, things that are happening immediately in Tibet, understandably grab the headlines because we know that people are suffering. We know the difficulties that they're facing. We know how hard it is for them to voice their objections to China's plans for the future of Tibet. But maybe that's all the more reason to look carefully and research carefully how China sees the future of Tibet. Because again, when we are focused on the short term, sometimes it's difficult to see the long-term trends and to see what is China's long-term objective. And I think it's a question that's really worth asking and I'm trying to answer. And that's something that I hope we can talk about.
And Damdul, now you were at the some of the gatherings of the Tibetan exiles in India, I believe. And I wonder if you could summarize, because the exiles came up with a major, quite comprehensive document looking at 4 future possible scenarios for Tibet. And I wonder if you could summarize some of those discussions for us.
Firstly, I would like to thank Gabriel for writing an honest review about the report. The report came out in 2024, but the conferences, which he rightly said, was spread across the world. Like it covered 3 different continents from April 2022 till November 2023. And I was basically involved in the India leg of the conference, whereby we had 2 such meetings, namely one in New Delhi, a one-day conference, and this was carried forward in Dharamsala, where we had a big conference, which all culminated in meeting His Holiness and presenting our findings to him. So something that I found very interesting about this conference compared to other such meetings that I've taken part in is how we discuss about the future. Like the future of Tibet is something done and initiated by voluntary Tibetans. I think no one was paid. It was just a voluntary action. And that's also something which is very interesting. And such exercises have been carried. Like I think 550, the meeting that the vision of this plan was also to discuss about Tibet in 5 years and 50 years. So there have been discussions. But what FOT, the future of Tibet, in my own opinion, distinguishes itself from these other conferences that Tibetans have led, is like how transparent it was, in my opinion. It was Tibetan led, Tibetans participate. Usually what I find when it comes to my own Tibetan community is we tend to discuss about what's happening now, what we should do. I mean, these are very important things. But sometimes I think the planning part, uh, it's not missing. There have been cases where our senior Tibetans of the elder generation have carried out similar exercises, be it during the 1970s, the 1980s. But me as a youngster, it's refreshing to find that even now such exercises are being carried forward. And this would more or less plan and create a pathway that we can take. I mean, at the end of the day, one does not know whether the plan would come to fruition or not. But if you have a plan, there is some sort of certainty that at least certain parts of the objectives might be looked. Through this conference, there were 4 basic scenarios. I think Gabriel mentioned about the scenarios. It is a popular exercise that is happening around the world. And here, the 4 basic scenarios that the conferences held in Dharamsala, likewise in Washington, in Paris, discuss were about number 1, the new hope, number 2, hanging in there, number 3, the crush opportunity, and the final chapter. Basically, it explores about the scenario from 2023 to 2040. And I mean, it's already 2025 right now, and I think one can definitely work on it. And one of the, how should I say it, not a drawback, like one of the concerns and one of the things that we would like to improve upon, which is clearly mentioned in the report, was like how we would like to have more participants from Tibet. I mean, those who came from Tibet, who were born in Tibet. I mean, we are fortunate to have a huge chunk of Tibetans who came from Tibet. And I think we did not publicly disclose it, but she has gone public. Namkila, who took part in the 17th Geneva Summit, she was very much part of our conference when we had in Dharamsala, and their insights were very interesting, you know, because at the end of the day, one of the goals was to connect Tibetans inside and outside Tibet. And as a speaker, as also a co-member like me, was Dr. Gelo. I mean, we invited him. He was one of the main panelists, but you know what happened during that time, 2023, when India and Canada was having that situation, his visa could not be processed. So, but we were fortunate to have his recordings. And I think the conference provided a whole nice understanding to all the participants on it. And the whole aim behind this Future of Tibet conference and initiative of change in some ways is to create a living document among Tibetans and also carry this forward and share it to the world. Because I think one thing about this document that is very interesting and very nice is how transparent it was. It was not like you had a meeting, discussed things, and kept it for yourself. It was shared to the public, and I think people like Gabriel have more or less gone through it very carefully and shared a very honest review, in my opinion.
Thank you. So as you say, many previously Tibetans, I think, hadn't spoken too much about future planning process. So this was, of course, a valuable exercise. Now, Gabriel, you've been trying to look into some of those possible scenarios with more detail from your background and your experience of a life immersed in working with Tibetans, working with Tibetan Rinpoches, young Tibetans, working with the CTA, working with policy researchers in India and in your home base of Australia. So, and you were encouraged by this exercise and gave important feedback on that. So I'd like to turn our attention to one of your latest blogs, which is a very expansive, comprehensive look at some of the scenarios that we may be facing. And you make a strong case for looking at China's policies in Tibet as a comprehensive strategy, and also Tibetans' responses to those and what the outcomes may be.
Yes, that Tibetan exercise by the young people across the world really stimulated me to think, well, is there anything I can add to that dialogue, add to those scenarios, to flesh them out, explore them in a little bit more detail. So I'm not trying to speak for Tibetans. All I can do is to look a bit more closely at China's long-range planning and see how that fits in Is it consistent with those scenarios? And it does seem to me that if we make the effort to connect the dots of things that we already know, but we don't necessarily see them as part of a wider pattern. So I want to zero in on what we usually call assimilation or language policy or the residential boarding schools. Now, there's been growing attention to all of that, but I don't know that we necessarily see that as a step in not only suppressing the mother tongue, splitting families as a cruel and traumatic way of imposing the Chinese language, but it also, I think, has a wider long-term context. I'm Australian, and this sounds, looks, and feels to me scarily similar to what white Australia did to First Nations Aboriginal Australia a century ago, and only stopped doing, in the last few decades. And because this has been debated, discussed, admitted, denied, apologized, justified, argued over for decades, it's a very lively, energetic topic in Australia. And the key concept that I think conveys the drama and the tragedy of what happened in Australia, I would suggest is relevant for Tibetans. In Australia, we talk bluntly and directly of the stolen generations of children taken from their mothers and put in white Christian or government institutions, forbidden to speak their mother tongue, required to learn English, required to learn the colonial version of Australian history, and to have their First Nations identity, fairly literally knocked out of them. And because that went on for generations, plural, we and largely stopped generations ago now, we are still, as a country, wrestling with the ongoing trauma of today's young Aboriginal people who are struggling to reconnect to their families, reconnect to their law, reconnect to their land, to make peace with themselves and with the culture that did this to them. We had a royal commission on the stolen generations. So to me, it's a much more powerful and evocative and communicative phrase that I would like to offer as an Australian for Tibetans to consider, because it's long term, because it acknowledges how deeply traumatic it is. If we talk about language policy, it sounds a bit bloodless. It sounds a bit technical. I think what China is doing, China has completely, and I say this, as somebody who basically studies China, China has lost patience with the Tibetans, not quite as furiously as they did 10 years ago with the Uyghurs, but nonetheless, with just as much determination to completely change everything. And which leads me to, another point. If what we have been calling assimilation is, a long-term process. Where does it end? What is the end point that China is aiming at? And again, I don't think that's any secret. I don't think it's something that is difficult to see at all. China is very explicit that it sees the future of all citizens, Chinese and Tibetans, as urban, living in cities that are designated as municipalities in which wherever they are, on whoever's land, no ethnicity has any special status. So Tibetans become just one of any number of ethnic groups for whom identity is just a purely personal lifestyle choice that has no status, no special significance, and no role in public life. Now, if urbanization is the ultimate destination that China envisages for most Tibetans, not all, because they still need some on the land, some to raise the yaks, etc., to supply red meat in an industrial cold chain logistic process for the increasing demand in China for red meat. But most will ultimately be urbanized. Are we saying that from exile, where we have the freedom to test and check that hypothesis, that proposition of mine, do we have anything to say to Tibetans in Tibet who have only Chinese propaganda to go on, and who are, understandably, because this is a universal phenomenon, attracted to urban life without having much opportunity to realize the costs of embracing city life and maybe leaving Tibet altogether and going to, see if you can find work in some of China's big cities that are very distant from Tibet. Now, we've just jumped from the current situation of assimilation, residential boarding schools, and also the relocation of lots and lots of rural Tibetans to new settlements in what are called frontier villages. And that gets a lot of attention. But again, why the frontier villages? Do they fit into a bigger picture? And that, again, I think is the joining of the dots that we've been missing. I would suggest, and it's in a way sort of really obvious, that the short-term purpose of the frontier villages as a chain, an archipelago, right along the north face of the Himalaya, facing the borders with India, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, etc., in the short term, is to securitize the border and send young adult Tibetans out on patrol, because the energy it requires to patrol the frontier, the border at high altitude, is something that very few Chinese can do. That they're just fatigued. They literally, physically can't do it. They can't get enough oxygen in their blood, whereas Tibetans can do it. So that's the short term. But also, what is China's long-term agenda in setting up the frontier villages? Again, I hope that in a way it's obvious. China is on what they would call a civilizing mission. Tibetans must enter the modern world. That is now compulsory. But they must enter the modern world as precarious gig workers who have learned the Chinese language, learned to do precarious, unpredictable work, do the hard work of building the frontier and trying to make a living somehow, but without any sort of security or guarantees, let alone the old-fashioned iron rice bowl that has long since disappeared, to use another Chinese phrase. So I see a connection between the displacement of lots of Drogpa nomads from their lands into the frontier villages as a first step in training Tibetans on a compulsory curriculum that can't be escaped into how to ultimately become urban. And I don't think China is in any hurry to do that. I think China right now still makes it very difficult for Tibetans to live in big towns and cities because China is still worried that if Tibetans do get together, do form crowds, do congregate, then they, are able to articulate their demands, and that reminds them of what happened in 2008 when the Tibetans rose up, and in 1987 and on many other occasions that didn't attract quite so many headlines. So I'm not saying that this is going to happen tomorrow. I'm saying this is a long-term agenda from the grasslands to the frontier villages, and ultimately, and when I say ultimately, China has focused a lot on two specific dates, 2035 and above all 2049, as the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic. And it may take up until 2049 before most Tibetans are urbanized. I have no idea, but that does seem to me to be the trend, the direction that things are going.
Gabriel, you chose these two dates for a reason. The first, Xi Jinping's plan for China's development, the first phase, 2020-2035, basically realized socialist modernization. The second phase, 2035 to 2049, to complete the transformation into a great modern socialist country by the centenary of the PRC's founding, and by which time China wants to lead the world. It wants to lead the world in this sort of new modern era, not only technologically, but also in terms of great power politics. And that's a battle that we see unfolding in the world now. So that's because presumably Tibet is of an often overlooked strategic significance to the PRC. Tibet is important because of its water, because of its mineral and natural resources, and also because of its border, which you've just spoken about with the frontier villages. Why is China undertaking this massive initiative of urbanization of the Tibetan people, displacing them from their rural landscape, ignoring the comparative advantage that you've pointed out in your blog, and engaging in the urbanization? Why is China doing that?
Good question. I think if a Chinese leader or a Chinese planner were to try to honestly answer that question, I think they would simply say that urbanization is modernity, it is efficiency, it is civilization, it is the delivery or the deliverability of modern services in a way that is highly concentrated and therefore economical, whereas a small population scattered more or less evenly right across a land, the Tibetan Plateau, the size of Western Europe, can never be as efficient. So from the planner's point of view, it's almost obvious that the reason why the richest countries in the world are rich is because they have such a high level of urbanization, and China still has a way to go. But I think there's a lot more to it than that, and China's ethnic policy planners, such as Wang Huning, for example, went to America in the 1980s, 1990s, and saw how Americans were welcoming skilled, energetic, hardworking immigrants from all over the world who, would form small ethnic communities wherever they settled, but none of them had a particularly strong voice, and it was understood that if you are a member of an ethnic group, that is not something that has any relevance in public life. And I think young Tibetans in exile, the same young Tibetans who did that future planning exercise we spoke of a few minutes ago, know this from daily life. Whether the Tibetans are living in Jackson Heights in New York, or Parkdale in Toronto, or Woolwich in London, or Campbelltown in Sydney, everybody knows how to get along with other immigrants from other countries with whom you might have something to share or not. But no way does being a Tibetan in Campbelltown or Woolwich or Parkdale or Jackson Heights, give you any special status whatsoever. You're simply part of the melting pot. So I think that is China's plan, but Tibetans will also have to spend decades in servitude doing the dirty work of development in remote areas, underpaid, overworked, under the thumb of Chinese project managers, probably for decades before that ultimate goal is realized, because China does still need people to do the gig work, to do the dangerous, underpaid, insecure the gig work of the whether it's growing yaks in the vat blocks of Golok, or whether it's being a taxi driver in Shanghai, or a fast food delivery guy in Beijing. There are still labor intensive work that the system is rigged to maximize precariousness and insecurity, maximize that and minimize the pay.
So, although you do, Gabriel, point to a counter trend as well of Tibetan young people who are choosing to move to urban areas, and they're building their own communities, and they're defending they're protecting their language. They're often developing new forms of expression, creative expression, new types of ways of living.
I think that's very limited, partly because China does not allow large numbers of Tibetans to come to the cities, whether we're talking about Lhasa and even pilgrims on their way to Lhasa still to this day find it really difficult to get permission to enter Lhasa or to stay there for more than a brief period. But if we look at Xining, is Xining the capital city of Amdo, Qinghai? Is it part of Tibet? Is it Tibetan? In what way is it a Tibetan city? Xining, from a Chinese point of view, they don't regard very highly. They would rather dismissively call it a fourth tier 4 city, which is, the lowest category. But it's a city of 3 million people. It's a city of high-rise apartments, high-rise buildings, intense concentrations of population, attracting immigrants from all over China. Now that there is money to be made in Qinghai, largely on Tibetan land and expropriating Tibetan resources, and yet the number of Tibetans allowed to live in Xining is actually still very small, and very few cultural or educational institutions. They're still there, at the whim of Chinese authorities. However, there have been some very smart young Tibetan ethnographers who have looked at the attitudes of young people who, like young people anywhere, grow impatient with the conservatism and the old habits of their elders, and find now that everybody in Tibet has a smartphone, so everybody can almost instantaneously tune into influencers, both in Chinese and in Tibetan. There are plenty of influencers in Tibetan who can show you the glamour of city life, the attractions of city life. And, if you're a young person and, you're trying to figure out who you are, and the attractions of village life seem, pretty limited, whereas if you live in a city, you could go out with, date young people you find attractive, a much wider range, without having elders breathing down your neck. I mean, the attractions of city life for young Tibetans, I don't think need any explanation. It's sort of obvious. It's universal. But is anybody saying to them there is a price to be paid, other than the elders, the lamas saying be careful, you'd better know what you're doing, will you be able to come back, our family ties being broken here, all of which sounds like really old-fashioned stuff, I think, in the eyes and ears of many young people who just find it irresistibly attractive to be able to wear ripped jeans or whatever is fashionable, without the elders in the village saying that's terrible, how could you do that? So again, the big picture is lacking. The guidance is lacking, and that's the situation that young exile Tibetans all over the world know from their own daily experience. And it's not for me to tell them what they should be saying or doing, but I wonder whether a bit more sharing of stories of what it means to be a tiny part of a big city, whether that might actually be useful or relevant.
So urbanization is part of a picture of interconnected strategies. You've referred to rural relocation, urbanization, Xi Jinping's strategic imperatives, and the securitization of not only city life, but also rural landscape as well, resource extraction, and tourism tourist development is all part of that picture that you've outlined as China seeks to move Tibet towards 2035 and 2049. I wonder if we could speak about tourism, Gabriel, and how that's being used as a tool to counter cultural resilience. But the impacts are dramatic, aren't they? That we're seeing now Chinese influencers staying at the St. Regis Hotel in Lhasa. We're seeing them taking the bullet train out to Ningtri, this heavily militarized town close to the border with Arunachal Pradesh. I wonder if you could talk about this as a new development, which is happening very, very fast.
Yes, again, a good question. Lhasa already is fairly literally overrun with tourists. The official population of Lhasa is under 500,000, and yet, according to China's own tourism statistics, 45 million Chinese domestic tourists arrive in Lhasa every year, and most of those are just in the warmer months of the year, which makes the overwhelming of Lhasa even more extraordinary, which makes Tibetans, who after all have always seen Lhasa as the holy city, the end point of pilgrimage, Rukor, the opportunity to purify the mind by going on pilgrimage, in the classic phrase, measuring the earth with our bodies. If they arrive in Lhasa and reach the holiest sites, such as the Potala, which is not just the phallus, the empty phallus of the Dalai Lamas, but Tibetans in their prayers pray to be reborn in the Potala, and by that they don't mean a building in Lhasa, they mean a pure land, a land from which it is possible to gain enlightenment, to purify the mind. So Lhasa and its physical Potala are extraordinarily important to Tibetans. Yet Tibetans find themselves at the holiest of places, the Potala, the Jokang, the Rukor, totally swamped by Chinese tourists who, at best, just see it as an exotic backdrop to take photos. But very often, these days, it's become fashionable to dress up in classic Chinese culturally cliched roles, as a Qigong master, a Kung Fu master, as a virgin bride, even dress up your kids in mock Tibetan clothes, in Tibetan hats and long sleeves, and execute a few moves from a Tibetan dance you've learned, very briefly. Sit astride a yak, cuddle a mastiff, the very fierce dogs that guard the very few possessions of the rural nomads, the Drogpa. This is turning Tibet into a charade, a travesty, a parody of itself, an authentic replica of itself, and making Tibetans perform Tibetan niceness, because again Tibet is marketed throughout China as a place where the people are nice. They're not like the Uyghurs. They're not chronically sort of angry and violent and terrorists. But they'll help you to relax and forget your urban worries and the competitive lives that you lead in big Chinese cities, where you're forever worrying about whether your children will get ahead and succeed in making money and getting rich and so on. So this is emotional labor that Tibetans are expected to perform for free. Nobody gets paid for doing this. And yet the 45 million tourists who arrive in Lhasa every year at the moment is nothing compared to what will happen once the railway all the way from Chengdu to Lhasa is complete, and it will be possible to travel by high-speed railway from the lowlands, the humid, unpleasant summer weather of the Sichuan Basin, all the way to Lhasa in 14 hours. Now, almost all Chinese these days have regular holidays that last a week, sometimes a bit longer than a week. At New Year, other days, other times of the year, other major holidays. So almost everybody will have both the time and the income to come to Lhasa. The income, because railway fares will be heavily subsidized if and when China overcomes the many physical obstacles to tunneling its way all the way through Tibet, which is a topic for another day, but it's certainly not proving easy. But if and when that railway is complete, and China's target date is only 5 years away for the whole thing to be complete. You mentioned that the section from Nyingchi to Lhasa is already functioning, and there are already high-speed trains on that section, which from an engineering point of view is a whole lot easier, because it basically just follows the Yalung Sangpo, which is in most areas a valley broad enough to allow the railway to run alongside the river, and often have to bridge it. The railway bridges the Yalung Sangpo no less than 16 times, which again just reduces, the major river of southern Tibet to just, picturesque scenery and maybe a very quick stop for a photo, and then, on you go. But again, this is just part of my suggestion that we do more than just think of the immediate short term, and start thinking in a little bit more long term. If 45 million people arrive in Lhasa now, that could easily double or treble or quadruple once the railway is built. We need to understand what railways are, why China is investing in high-speed, double-tracked, electrified, heavily tunneled and bridged, very expensive railway construction. Railways are to China and Tibet what airlines are in Europe or in America, or the interstate highway system in America. They collapse time and distance. They bring Tibet much closer to China in both time and space. They weave Tibet into China in ways that at the moment we struggle to imagine. And again, we shouldn't be naive about this. This is part of a master plan. It is part, and in exactly the same way that you can look on a map at all of the power lines and highways that bring Tibet closer to China, that export electricity, export water from hydro dams and so on. The railway is part of that project of making Tibet irrevocably and irretrievably connected to China, economically, linguistically, culturally, politically, in every way. And again, I think, we need to understand that, scary as it is, and prepare for it, rather than be shocked a little too late. Once the number of tourists who come not only to Lhasa, but then fan out from Lhasa to other destinations, because Tibet by then will have been turned into a circle of destinations, so that there'll be something to advertise as the brand identity image of, come to Nagchu and experience the real rural Tibet and ride on a yak. Come to Ngari and witness the strange spectacle of Tibetans prostrating to a mountain, etc., etc., etc.
About what Gabriel mentioned, I think the years is very interesting, because 2035 and 2049, he pointed these both years, and 2035, it's the 70th year of the establishment of the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region. So I think China is targeting, this year they're celebrating the 60th year. So it's very interesting how they've been able to sort of push the narrative and come to the understanding throughout the world, which I've also observed more or less, like how when people mention Tibet, they sort of see Tibet as star. That's not the Tibet that Tibetans see. So that is very interesting. And also the year of 2049, it's basically the centennial year of the formation of the People's Republic of China. But what we have in India is also like 2047, Viksit Bharat, the 100th year of the Republic of India's establishment. And something very interesting, I don't know whether it was intentionally done, but doing my own research to us, and I found out how I can give the claim to Loten Namling, I believe, who worked at the Department of International Relations and Information at the CTA, of how His Holiness, when he says, like, of late he's been saying, I'll live long for more than 110 years. There was this number of 113. So if you go along that number, if you calculate that, when His Holiness was born, it falls right between India's centennial and China's centennial, 2048. So what is this diplomatic strategy? So I'm not sure. Like, these are just inferences when you go along these numbers. So these were the things that I found interesting of what Gabriel said, and also Xining, for that matter. Very interesting area. One where much contestation happens between Tibet and China. Like, it has its own history. I think during the Tibetan Empire time, the Tibetan kings went till that. There's a stone pillar there, if I'm not wrong. And even the birthplace of His Holiness, Taksar Amto, sort of is very much nearby that region. And I've never been to Tibet myself, and I've not seen Xining in my own eyes. But there's a nice documentary captured by Tenzing, whose parents were from that very region, called A Stranger in My Native Land. And it shows what's happening there, which Gabriel, rightly described, like how China is trying to assimilate. These very frontier lands are where the real push and pull happens. We can see the real push and pull happening between Tibet and China at this border. But right now, another point which Gabriel mentioned about these Shaokang villages and the Vibrant Villages program, which India is carrying out, the push and pull happening between China, it's Tibet for that matter, and India at the southern border. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, you just added a lot that's very useful there, Damdul.
It's worth mentioning the sort of rather chilling juxtaposition of China's security state with the tourism objectives, and a vivid indicator of that is that the Lhasa's Intercontinental Hotel, with its white space-age snow peaks design, is literally next door to Gutsa Detention Center, which is one of the most notorious prison facilities in Lhasa, where so many monks and nuns and civilians endured brutal torture, particularly after the 1980s and after 2008 as well. So there is already one high-altitude railway that goes from Golmud and Qinghai to Lhasa, but this railway that you're talking about, the Lhasa-Chengdu link, is going to, I think, have a far greater impact. It goes through areas that are far more heavily populated, areas that are really important areas of biodiversity and population centers, urban centers. It cuts through, and also some of those areas in Kham and Amdo Kham that are strong in Tibetan cultural identity and resilience. So this railway is likely to have a far greater impact. And I think that the important thing, what you're doing is you're arguing for these policies to be looked at as an entire whole, not only piecemeal, so that we're not only looking at rural depopulation, we're looking at how that figures in China's grand plan and how it connects together.
I think that's exactly right. As I keep saying, we need to connect the dots. So let's start with the fact that almost every policy China has for rural Tibet always has an element of explicitly requiring Tibetans to leave the land, to depopulate. Whether the rationale of the policy is to create national parks, or to guarantee water supply, or to grow more grass, or poverty alleviation, or hydro dams to export electricity. Whatever the policy, it always includes explicit provisions to remove Tibetans from the land. And if you take that together with the tourist influx of tourists who are coming to treat Tibet as a consumer item, Tibet as something to be consumed for a break before you go back to the urban rat race, I think that tells us, again, something quite basic about China's whole approach to Tibet, because what I would suggest is that Tibet is the first landscape that China has conquered where it has not been able to make it Chinese by the very simple and direct process of populating it with poor, landless, Han Chinese peasants. They did that in Xinjiang. They did that in Sichuan. They did that in Yunnan. They did that in Guangxi. They did that in Guizhou. They did that in Yunnan. It is the classic Chinese pattern that the army conquers, the army digs in, the army builds a garrison to permanently remind the conquered people that they should not rise up because they will be crushed. But the army needs to eat and to source its food supply locally, if possible, for the sake of security. So if you move in a whole lot of landless Chinese peasants, who can then grow food to sell or feed to the garrison, that provides security, and it provides income, and it provides colonial settlers. Tibet is the only geography where that was not possible, because Han Chinese consistently find Tibet unnaturally cold. The air is far too thin. Very few Chinese crops can grow in Tibet. So it has taken China 70 years to come up with a master strategy that does enable them to install permanent, long-term dominance, hegemony inside Tibet. And that has two aspects. One is to remove Tibetans from the land, and the other one is to create industries that employ a lot of Han Chinese, and hospitality, tourism, is a very labor-intensive industry. From hotel staff, room-maids, tour guides, all the way through to, local community song and dance troupes performing a version of Tibetanness. There will be employment for a very large number of Han Chinese across Tibet in the tourism industry, in the national parks, not just in the urban areas, in a way that China has never succeeded in doing before. And again, I don't think this is me making things up or something that's obscure. What occurs to me is that this is actually all rather obvious, that this is the long-term trend. I mean, we could even go so far as to say that China faces the classic dilemma that all empires face of how do you turn alien rule under an empire into a unitary nation state, where everybody feels a common sense of belonging, membership, citizenship, and loyalty, and a common language. And that is exactly what China is doing. And as a result, there is now a compulsory textbook that teaches an incredibly simplified version of Chinese history to all young Chinese and young Tibetans, and it must be learned. There will be an exam. You will be tested on your knowledge of this oversimplified cartoon version of China's unbroken 5,000 years of Han Chinese culture, starting with a mythical character who never lived called the Yellow Emperor, and Tibetans are now all officially, compulsorily, children of the Yellow Emperor. Again, let's protest the cruelty of this propaganda, but let's also see the wider pattern, the direction that this is all heading. I think that is really useful.
Gabriel, is China's success assured?
I think only Tibetans can answer that. As an outsider, as a non-Tibetan, I can say that Tibet has survived worse. It survived the Cultural Revolution, which was more overtly violent and destructive. But today's campaign, while it's not as violent and indiscriminate as the liquidation of the aristocracy and the lamas in the 1960s, 1970s, it is much more determined and much more planned and much more thorough. But I think ultimately Tibetans will, again, as they did in the 1960s and 1970s, discover or rediscover, if necessary, their inner strengths. And there are signs in Tibet of a major religious revival underway right now in Tibet, which it's wise not to talk about publicly, because it only makes the Chinese lash out without knowing what they're lashing out against. But let's just say that the classic Marxist position that religion is the opium of the masses, religion is poison, as Mao infamously said to the young Dalai Lama in Beijing 60 years ago, 70 years ago. Let them believe that. The Tibetans know better. Tibetans know that what we conventionally call religion has the power to awaken powers of the mind, the nature of the mind, in a way that is capable of handling anything and everything. And I think personally that is the great strength, the great inner strength of Tibetans individually and of Tibetan culture. And for that reason, I think Tibetans will be very good at the outward display of compliance and saying all the right things and performing all the right slogans, and China will once again believe its own propaganda that the Tibetans are all happy and smiling and dancing and singing and enjoying living under China. But inside, those Tibetan strengths will only strengthen. That's personally my hunch. It's only a hunch, but it is based on what happened in the 1960s and 1970s.
And also the ways in which Tibetans continue to demonstrate that resilience and adherence to their culture, their spiritual core values.
Yeah, I mean, even if there are not that many overt demonstrations, acts of resistance, and shouts of defiance, shouts of despair, they are not the only way of gauging what is really going on in the hearts and minds of Tibetans. It may take us a long time to even notice the depth of what's happening right now, long after I'm gone.
Well, thank you, Gabriel. I think we'll leave it there for that discussion. Unless, Gabriel, is there anything else? I mean, I think that's an appropriate place to end a podcast with your reflections on the Tibetan strength. Thank you for listening to this FMVA podcast. For more videos, click on the link and please subscribe to FMVA's YouTube channel. You can get our podcasts wherever you can listen online.